has traveled the world looking at life through eyes that see far more than just the mundane and physical, to document and report back on some of the wildest depths of beauty and consciousness that one can find. Darragh Mason Field joins us on Rogue Ways tonight to share with us from his work as a photographer and documentary film artist of work such as City of Djinn. Darragh, welcome to Rogue Ways, and how are you doing tonight?
Thank you. I'm great. I'm a little bit tired. It's 2 a.m. here here in the UK, so if I look a little bit bleary-eyed, that's what it is.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us from way over there. And it's always hard to make the schedules merge when we're working from across the pond, so to speak. So it's very cool.
Yeah, and it's something that kind of like I habitually get wrong. So I'm really glad we got it bang on tonight.
Yeah, we were right. I know. I'm the same way. I'm like, oh, what did I just say? I don't know. And then when I'm scheduling, I don't know about you, but Google Calendar is what I use, which I know I shouldn't because it screws me over all the time. Because it'll just like change time zones on me. It'll delete entries and move them around. Like, this is insane. And I know because we were just talking before the show about the electronic fuckery that we experience. Very likely because of the types of things that we like to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. And it can be quite expensive.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And it goes way beyond the kind of the calls dropping out. You know, 2 phones and 1 laptop in the last 10 days have fried on me. So
it's crazy. And people who maybe have not experienced such things think like, oh, it's like user error, or like, oh, they're not very careful with their things, or we can always like try to explain it away, but when it happens to you, you're like, no, there is no explanation for this. It should not be happening.
It shouldn't. It really shouldn't. And when I look at kind of some of my photographic work, so I've been to India quite a few times, and when I went to shoot the story on the Djinn in 2016, a week before I went, my camera failed. It wasn't a year old. Wow. And basically I used to do a lot of time-lapse stuff, so I did kind of just point the camera at the sky, come back in 4 hours, and like just beautiful star moving, all that kind of stuff. And robust camera is designed to do that kind of thing. Then I noticed something moving across the frames. So it'd be like a little piece like dirt, looked like it was moving across frame. Or if you can imagine, like an insect would have been on the front of the lens and it looked like it was moving. So, but it wasn't an insect. It was some piece of dirt that was inside the camera body. So standard thing, bringing it in to get it cleaned. And so the first technicians were like, it's oil, but we can't clean it off. It just keeps coming back. Took it to then they go like, these are the guys you need to talk to. These are the guys that we go to, the technicians. When we can't fix it, these are the guys we go to. Went to them. They're like, we've never seen anything like this. We can't clean it. We recommend that like you take apart the body and put a new kind of housing in. So like it was completely done under a year-old camera. And then I can't find the warranty for it as well. And I'm quite meticulous, that kind of stuff. So I'm like, okay, a week before I'm going to India, my camera is completely foobarred. And, luckily I was able to get one from a friend who was an editor for Photography magazine. And away I go. But that wasn't the end of it. It didn't get much better from there. And this
was before you even left, so I can't imagine.
My dad came with me. My dad came with me, and he broke his tooth in the airport.
God.
And it was just, it could have all hell broke loose, and like it was one of those ones where talking with kind of paranormal investigators or retired paranormal investigators who retired for this very reason, like years later, like, you were totally be messed with, you were totally be messed with. That's what happens. But before I went, sorry, you going to ask a question? I was still running my mouth.
Well, I was just going to add that I think a lot of people in this sort of realm of experience will assume that it's like the NSA or the government or like some sort of AI algorithmic like program that's been attached to you electronically, which can happen and is a thing, But I think that also allows some people to discount that some of it, at least, is actually paranormal or supernormal or however you want to describe that, and that it's also targeted and also related to the topics and the subjects that you that you go into.
Definitely my experience. You know, and when I've had people kind of join me on my podcast for conversations on this subject matter, same things, booted out of calls, you know, all that kind of stuff. I've also had kind of bad experiences after certain shows, you know, that can come up from doing this kind of work. Are you familiar with Jerry Marzinski at all?
Yeah, I've had him on the show before.
Yeah, you know Jerry. Yeah, very lovely guy. So he's on my show as well, and we talked through his work. You know, and I kind of, you know, you get these different kind of levels of expertise, and we come together from different angles and we exchange stuff. You know,
very similar subject. And for those who don't know, Darragh, obviously we're going to get into it more, but has done documentary work on Djinn, and then Jerry Marzinski works with psychological patients who are suffering often from things like schizophrenia and otherwise, and his experience has shown him that there are other entities that are actually creating much of these like symptoms and experiences that people are having. Years and years of trying not to believe that and to discount it have kind of proven to him that is what's going on. So very similar fields of expertise. That's a fascinating show, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was. We ended up, I mean, in total, we ended up talking for about 3 hours, you know, like about just under 2 hours of which we broadcast, and then bits were just kind of us going, and have you heard this? You know, like off the air. But it was interesting finally getting to talk to him, because after kind of, I'll come back to the Djinn stuff, but when I came back from India, and that kind of opened a kind of whole rabbit hole for me that took me in a number of different directions, but primarily thinking about spirit intrusion, what is happening with spirit intrusion, and looking at things from an Islamic perspective, and marrying that up with kind of the more broadly known in the West kind of Christian perspective. And the idea of obsession, like in terms of obsession and how that leads into possession, it has an exact analog in Islam called waswas, or waswaza, depending on kind of where you are in the Islamic world. And that directly translates as the whispering of devils. That's what it means.
So you're talking about obsession as in like obsessive compulsive, just the obsessive side of obsessive compulsive, not just like some people use it very casually, like, oh, I'm obsessed with the color pink right now. It's like, no, there's actual obsession where you like cannot stop focusing on something. Well,
it's that's kind of the modern interpretation of the word, but the Christian interpretation of the word is it's a precursor to full-on possession. It's like it's when the behavior changes, where there is intrusion, but is not yet total domination. There's not yet total.
So somebody would be affected by a spirit, but not yet possessed.
Correct.
Yeah. Oh, okay, I didn't realize that was what that was. Okay.
Yeah, that's what obsession is, and was is the Islamic analog, and it literally translates as the whispering of demons, right? So the whispering of devils, whispering of Djinn, which is exactly what happens and what Jerry Marzinski is describing.
Yeah.
Right. So I was kind of building the case with, okay, so we've got this in Christianity, we have this in Islam, we have Swedenborg describing the same thing, the Swedish scientist, well, incredible polymath, describing the same thing, and then you have people like Jerry Marzinski, and he's not the only one, you know, who are kind of medical professionals who have seen enough and experienced enough that they get to that same conclusion, that they're like, well, this is not always an internal thing. There's an external thing here as well, and here are the evidence sets for that. And it's an important thing for me, because really when I start to think about this more and more, I said, okay, we're not saying everybody who has some kind of, you know, mental health issue has got a spirit injury. That's a ludicrous assertion. It's like, you know, mental health's a real thing. Yeah, you know, mental health issues are very, very real. They affect a huge amount of the populace. But what if there's a sizable percentage of them that are spiritually related, and we're not dealing with them in any kind of way that's helpful?
Yeah.
And those ways that are helpful have already existed for thousands of years in, you know, in our ancestry, right? You know, and cultures that still have kind of shamanic systems know how to deal with those problems far more effectively than we do.
Yeah.
You know, and And that's not to discount any of the achievements of Western medicine.
No.
You know, like if I break my leg, I'm not looking for a shaman to sort me out. I'm straight down to the accident emergency ward. You know, I'm not saying.
Or better yet, let's do both. You know,
Yeah.
like have some prayers and some spiritual energy going into it, and also have the person who actually knows how to like stitch you up and
Exactly. Yeah.
whatever. I like recently I've really been and I think I've heard it before, but it's just been becoming more apparent, and I've heard it more and more recently that, you know, the material, if you want the material to be worked on and cured or healed or whatever, then you want Western medicine, because we're really good at cutting things out, putting things in, like modifying the chemical balance. It's all very material. But if you want, there's so much to illness, I think, even breaking your bone maybe, or doing something like that, that can be spiritual, that, you know, but we don't address that at all in Western society. We have no basis for including the spiritual in our lives almost at all. And when we do, it's very controlled and, I don't know, highly metered, and not very, it has no depth or soul, really.
Yeah. And an interesting thing that I've noticed as well is that there's so many mental health professionals, right, all have some kind of spiritual practice, from Reiki to magic to shamanism. It's a prolific thing. So this is totally instinctive, but it feels to me is that in some way, people who have that calling, you know, are starting to kind of just go out and get that spiritual piece for themselves, to bring that to their practice. And they may not be doing that officially, but it's there within them, and it's something that they can give to people who need it.
Yeah, it's interesting. My very first Reiki experience was from my massage practitioner, and I didn't know what Reiki was, or that they were doing Reiki, but I suddenly had this feeling in my throat as though I was going to cry, and I was like, it was bothering me, you know, it was like really strong feeling, and I was like, what the hell? My eyes were closed, as they usually are during my massages, and I just said like, oh, my throat is so weird right now. And he's like, oh yeah, I'm doing some Reiki work on your throat. And I was like, what the hell is Reiki work? Like, but it's weird because I didn't even know. And then I had this experience, and it correlated, you know, with what this person was doing. So I was like instant believer, because I understood intrinsically that there was something actually happening. Yeah. But it's very true. And I think very honest people, if you're traveling down this path of medical, you know, Western medical traditions, you at some point have to acknowledge all of the things that Western medicine does not treat or have explanations for or have understandings of. And so if you're a very honest person and you're academic, you would go looking, you know, for things that do address that.
Yeah.
And find exactly what you're talking about. Marry those things together. Now your practice is even better.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I hope that's an evolution that will happen, you know, and we get into a better space, you know.
Yeah.
Because that's ultimately what we want to figure out with this exploration, isn't it? It's like, well, how do we make life better for people who are suffering from this kind of stuff?
Yeah, and how do we work with all
how do we navigate it? Yeah, that's the technology, you know, and that's the point, really. Like, and so in a lecture that I put together in YouTube, talking about was an obsession, and it describes the kind of I mixed the two together. So I kind of go, well, look, this is a kind of a list of the symptoms as they were laid out within Christianity, and the symptoms as they're laid out within Islam, and they are primarily this type of stuff you'd expect to see in terms of mental health, like OCD. It's you know, obsessive compulsive thoughts, you know, like constantly. Well, I'm not going to describe OCD, as everyone knows what that is, and then, you know, depression, anxiety, and all that kind of stuff. But it also talks about prevention of practice, so stuff that would kind of deviate you from your religious path, whatever that might be. And it's an interesting thing, because both kind of in the Quran and in the Bible, there are references to Satan in the Christian sense, and Iblis in the Islamic sense, saying specifically that I will be there to lead mankind off the path. And that's what happens within Islam and obsession.
Yeah.
You know? And I found I struggled with that initially, because I kind of thought, well, look, you know, it's Christians, or it's Abrahamics broadly, saying that kind of when you start to lose your belief in the faith, that's the devil or it's Iblis. So it's
Yeah.
it's kind of got that propaganda bit to it. You're like,
Right.
really, you know?
Indoctrination a bit.
Yeah, exactly. So I think once you can kind of park that bit for a minute and kind of then actually look at what it says in those received texts, you know, in the holy books, then you can see they're actually talking to it already, you know, and there's numerous accounts throughout kind of the last 2,000 years written by religious scholars saying exactly that this is the temptation is there to move you away from God. And that's the point. And it's like, and when we talk about kind of was it the whispering of devils, it's the temptation. It's to get you to do things that will ultimately destroy you spiritually.
And I want to also add here for people who are like, screw Western or Abrahamic traditions, you know, like this is actually, as far as I understand in my experience, this is universal, and we're just looking at it through this lens, you know. And I know that you have touched on the same thing in what of your work I've seen, that Djinn is just another word for whatever this entity is, and every culture and every tradition has some sort of description of this. You know, it's just that the Abrahamic and the Christian traditions are much more accessible in the West here, but
100%, you're absolutely correct. That's exactly it. You know, like, and when I was first started exploring this stuff, I was like, okay, well, how do we have direct analogs between kind of, you know, particular taboos in Arabic or Islamic countries, more specifically, and then like in the west of Ireland, how do we have the almost exact same thing? You know, and one thing I'm talking about specifically is the idea of taboos around throwing out dirty water out of the house. So, like in Egypt, someone throws dirty water out of the house, they'll say Bismillah, right? And that's kind of like, you know, it's kind of the all covering kind of God bless type thing, or Allah, reference to Allah, and but it's also warning Djinn to get out of the way, because you can accidentally harm a Djinn, and if you harm a Djinn, you'll incur the wrath of the Djinn. They're incredibly vindictive. That's what they're seen as being.
I agree.
Exact same thing in Irish, in the Gaelic language. Someone's throwing water out of the house, kind of your Irish peasants from the 1800s throwing water out of the house. They'll say, you know, they'll reference kind of Ishkasalak, which is dirty water, and then kind of like some kind of blessing, right? The same thing is to kind of warn the fairies to get them out of the way. And it's like, I mean, when I was reading through kind of my research, and I was like, I mean, these are the same thing, right? These are the same thing, right? So I was like, well, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Like, is it because, okay, we got Christianity, we have Islam, they're on the same lineage, they're Abrahamic, right? But that's not kind of within any kind of prescriptive doctrine or faith, right? You know, like that is a very specific cultural nuance,
right?
So is it two cultures experiencing the same thing but manifesting very similar responses? You know, like there's more and more of them.
Right.
You know, the Djinn travel in wind. Angi Hashi is a method of how the fairies used to travel, which means the fairy wind, and that's how they travel. You know, you can get if the fairy wind touches you, you're not long for this world. It's important that you're going to die, you know, or make you fairy struck, like have a kind of a stroke. Exact same thing with the Djinn are associated with epilepsy and strokes, that kind of thing. You know, so it seems to be just two cultures describing the same thing.
Right.
You know, the same experience or the same interaction, rather.
It's so fascinating. And I love that about the Djinn. Well, it's like Djinn, demons, fairies, and even, and I wonder what you think about this, but extraterrestrial, supposed extraterrestrial interaction. Oh, yeah. Right? 100%, it also seems to have
totally.
The exact same qualities.
Like the same thing. It's like fairies. You go to fairyland. Fairyland is some sort of, you know, it's some sort of serene kingdom.
Yeah, it's like dark, but it has light.
Just like dark has a light. Weird space. You often meet the dead there. So it's got kind of chthonic pieces to it. But it's the loss, you know, there's loss of time or extended time. You know, like an hour in fairyland is a week in the normal world, and all this kind of stuff.
Same thing, so missing time.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's an incredible amount of it. You know, like And with Djinn, it's very similar. It's the same thing, like and the amount of it is uncanny. That's the thing that kind of really struck me. It's like the sheer volume of these like folkloric accounts is remarkable. Like it's absolutely remarkable. Changelings, same thing with Djinn. The fear of Lilith, like the child killer, which is also like within Jewish traditions as well.
Yeah.
So she is the enemy of young mothers and children, and that kind of period of time of like 7 days after a child is born is extremely vulnerable. Like within kind of Irish folklore traditions, that kind of time before a child is baptized is this extreme vulnerability where it can be taken and replaced with a changeling. And like there's a whole raft of kind of like terrible connotations really with kind of there was very real socioeconomic reasons for infanticide really, in an extremely impoverished society like Ireland was for most of its history. Things like infanticide happened and were justified for certain reasons, but also kind of like people genuinely believed this stuff. It wasn't just kind of like, oh yeah, it's changed. Like people genuinely believed it.
And they were like, I do not want this thing around me. Yeah. Like, yeah. It's hard too, because there's a lot of this, just like we were saying earlier, like you could chalk it up to sort of superstition or just whatever, this is just kind of religious ramblings or whatnot. But at the same time, you can't really explain away how all of these experiences, like we were talking about, have happened in all these different cultures, and they're all similar, and they all share the same sorts of characteristics. They also share the same sorts of ways that you might banish it or keep it from happening. And that's just fascinating. I mean, we just have like different words for it, but it's happening all throughout recorded history, in various ways. And so then it kind of makes you have to reckon with, like, if it's happening for that long over and over again, all these different cultures, what is it?
Absolutely. Are we just going to ignore all that? It would be crazy to do so. And it's like, we talk about kind of what methods of dealing with these issues, like I was talking to Joshua Cutchin a couple of weeks ago about this. We had a really good conversation about it. And one of the kind of points I was making is that, like, well, okay, right. So within the Islamic tradition, you use things like tools like ruqya, which is a type of healing, right? It's kind of a sanctioned healing, and that's for removing jinn, right? So they'll kind of a whole treatise on how to remove jinn. They'll certain passages from the Quran that they'll read, shuras and hadiths that they'll read to help clear the patient of the jinn or sorcery or evil eye or whatever it is. So within kind of a Christian framework, we have certain psalms that work, prayers that work, to kind of protection. So the issue I have is like within kind of monotheistic religions, right, where they're like, there's one God, right? How come if I invoke Jesus or if I invoke Allah, both will work?
Yeah.
What's going on there? And it's like, it seems to be, if there's any kind of invoking of a higher power, whatever that is, that seems to have some sort of prophylactic effect. It seems to repel whatever it is.
I mean, I think maybe part of it has to do with your personal belief, right? Because if I invoke, I don't know, some like Ganesh or something, I don't know if it would help as much as if I invoke Jesus because I know Jesus better. But I feel like it's the same type of thing that we were just talking about, where like jinn have all these different names depending on where you're at. God has all these different names depending on where you're at, right?
Yeah.
And then I don't know if there's all these other positive entities too that are not necessarily God, but maybe like, I don't know, angels, saints, people say ascended masters. Like, I don't really know where I stand on all that, but maybe there's kind of like hierarchies and,
I think the unseen world is got as many layers to it as the material world does,
Right.
And probably far more complex. But one of the interesting things we were talking about was iron and kind of the protective qualities of iron.
Yeah, why iron?
It's an interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so random seeming.
Yeah. But it's everywhere. Iron
it is.
The stuff it's incredible. Like I know in my film, did you see the iron chain at the start of the film?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So there's an iron chain dangling at the start of the film, and that's outside a tiny little Sufi shrine in Delhi's Ridge Forest called. I mean, I'm terrible at the pronunciation, so it's Khawaja Mudaddin Krushti. And
it's good to me.
not bad. It's a tiny shrine in Delhi's Ridge Forest, and it's a tomb. Basically, it's a tomb of a hereditary Sufis, and the name is the name of the original saint. So people go there for treatment with Djinn, and one of the Djinn and evil spirits is in separate things. So one of the ways of identifying if someone has a Djinn problem is there's an iron chain dangling just outside the entrance to the shrine. So one holds the chain, and if you can hold the chain and step across the threshold, then it's not a Djinn problem, right? So that's the immediate diagnosis.
That's awesome.
Excuse me. Can't hold
and
the
Sufis
Djinn.
Sufis are the Islamic mystic.
Yeah.
Basically, Islamic mystics.
Yeah.
They're the whirling dervishes and
That's it. So that's had the kind of process of identification, and then if it's identified that it is a Djinn, then the process of removal starts, and that's again, as I said, like hadiths and shuras and treatment with Quranic water, all kinds of different things, and fire is actually used to treat Djinn, which is weird because you think kind of like, well, they're fire spirits, they're called fire spirits, but apparently kind of I was reading one particular Ruqya master. I can't remember his name, but he was saying that kind of they are very sensitive to fire, to exposure to fire. That it's magnified to what the human sensation would be, and they do that by kind of like holding like kind of like candles near the patient's feet, not on the patient, but near the patient's feet. And so proximity makes it deeply uncomfortable for the Djinn, and then trying to push them to leave. And use a thing called Quranic water, which is water which has had the verses of the Quran read over. It's very similar like to holy water.
Yeah.
But they start the process of that process with praying, and it varies from country to country. It's not prescriptive as like the Catholic rite of exorcism is, where it doesn't matter where you are, it's the same thing. Yeah. Like it's quite varied within Islam from what I've seen. But then they would get the Djinn, and they would ideally remove the Djinn and move it to. There was this little kind of clay pots around the forest floor, and they're called matkas, and they're basically, you know, genie in a bottle.
Yeah,
that's what they are. Right, so they're kind of like the Djinn's taken out and it's trapped in the bottle, so it's magically sealed there.
So if someone goes and opens it, you do release a Djinn.
Yeah, that's basically it. It's like kind of like spiritual landmines lying around the forest floor.
I don't know if I should feel bad for them. They're like trapped in a pot forever, or, you know, like.
Yeah, I mean within Islam, they've a different way of looking at it. Like they will talk about kind of converting the Djinn to Islam. So it's not like we think of demons. It's not like they're all evil or they're all like dark, like just trying to eat everybody. Like there's a kind of variety and a spectrum. Absolutely, they've seen it as a spectrum completely, and this is where kind of like I think the Islamic understanding and view of the unseen world is ahead of the Western, or ahead of the Christian one, in my opinion anyway, is that it sees and it refers to Djinn as very much a replica of kind of human society. And it's like there's good Djinn, there's bad Djinn. There's Djinn who are agnostic and kind of, you know, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, you know, so it's much more reflective of kind of human behavior. Whereas we're more, in the West, is more binary. It's like there's demons, they're bad, and that's it.
Yeah.
You know,
again.
Yeah. So sometimes kind of Ruqya practitioner will look to convert the jinn to Islam, or will employ jinn who are converted to Islam to help them remove the jinn who's harassing an individual. So it's a lot more complex. It's not kind of that binary thing at all.
Yeah, which is, I mean, and part of the complexity of that is that you have to then learn to trust some jinn, which I don't know that I'm definitely not in a place where I would ever do that. I would just have this sort of blanket, like, I'm not going to deal with any entities and you can all just go away. But that's
which I think
like,
is a sensible approach.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's interesting. Someone was asking in the chat a little earlier. They were saying, because jinn are smokeless fire, which I think we mentioned before. That's how they're described, at least. They're being made of smokeless fire, which, am I saying that right, or fireless smoke?
No, smokeless fire is correct.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Smokeless fire, and someone was saying, does that make them an elemental spirit? And I don't think it's the
plasma,
same, right?
I think, is probably what has been described.
Which then I wonder now, just randomly, going off of that, plasma would feel like would have a easier time affecting electronics and electric currents and whatnot than maybe other entities could, and I see that a lot and experience that a lot, and so I wonder if it's always jinn that are doing that type of interference, or if it could be a lot of different things. Or
well, I think it's probably worth kind of unpacking what the word jinn means, and like it is a catch-all term. It just means kind of like it's unseen or hidden. And even if you just look at kind of the different types of jinn, like there's a huge array of jinn. Like, so the whole idea of like a zombie comes from a ghoul jinn, and they are the ones that are kind of like those like kind of corpsey looking things that kind of eat people in the desert, right? They hang out in kind of graveyards. And there's Ifrit, Marid, Quarines, and then Quarine is kind of like your doppelganger, and it's kind of very close to the kind of the Greek idea of the kind of daemon. Very similar to that. So it's kind of like you're the good angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other. It's like the Korean might be both, and so it's like there's a whole array of these different type of beings that have been defined, but they're all collectively known as jinn, and then to some kind of like really kind of like hilarious kind of characters, like characters with like just one big foot and head in the chest, and then or therianthropic, kind of part animal, part human looking creatures. Color is a big thing for them, like color, like kind of like you hear things like the red king, the black king, the green king, and like there'll be kind of different types of jinn denoted by color.
Wow. And they probably have allegiances, like little jinn are like, I'm going to be with the red king.
yeah, exactly. So there's all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot there, there's a huge amount there, and it's exactly the same in the fairy world. You've got so many different types of fairy.
True.
It's just a catch-all term.
Right. I didn't think of it that way, but that makes a lot of sense, and it makes me think of, in Japan they have is it yokai? Someone will correct me if I'm saying there's some sort like, and it just means monsters basically, and it's like all these different, they've all these different characters and types of monsters, and it just reminds me of the very same thing where you can just kind of put on whatever skin, and it makes me wonder, like, do you think these things actually have that, is there kind of some aspect of their permanent appearance, so to speak, whether it's in the astral or this realm, or do you think that they just can kind of take on whatever, and that's just what they're doing at the moment? And
that's a really good question, actually, because I think we get into this. I think we get into the space of around, like, almost into cryptids, and looking at kind of what things manifest, and why they manifest as the way they do.
Yeah.
And in some way that they're reacting to us, they're reacting to kind of our memories, our cultural reference points, and they're playing them back to us. But they never get them quite right. They're always a little bit skew with, right? So like within, within fairy lore, you have the, fairies appear, they'll be dressed like, I tend to talk to Irish fairies because it's it's obviously closer to home.
Yeah.
But it's from an Irish perspective, fairies appear. They're dressed kind of like the local people, but maybe 3 decades, 4 decades out.
Yeah. You're like,
It's
something's just off. Like, you're
off.
not
Yeah,
quite hitting it
something's
right.
off. Yeah. So so this, and you have that with the kind of the Men in Black in kind of modern UFO folklore. That they come up, they always look like they're from the 50s.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of thing. So
Or even with like there's like Hat Man. People talk about Hat Man. He's just always got a hat and I
yeah,
think an overcoat or something and like some
yeah,
aspect of plaid. But then there's all these different aspects too. Like he had hairy hands in that
yeah,
person's experience and he had no hands at all in that person's. And it's kind of like the same. Like, are they just
yeah,
not getting it right or are we not perceiving it right? Or like,
yeah. It's hard to tell. I think first off is like we can never really understand what the motivations are.
right.
Because we're talking about kind of an an entity, a consciousness, or a multitude of entities, but that sit outside time and space.
Yeah.
Like that our understanding and our experience of kind of a linear pattern of existence is just irrelevant to them. Where they can seemingly jump in and jump out, and when we talk about kind of time differences and all that kind of stuff, that clearly when we interact with them, we end up perceiving time differently,
Yeah.
and they've got dominion over time, dominion over reality. They can appear in different ways. They can control our perception. So they have that, whatever they are, they have that ability. So with that ability must have basically we're lower on the food chain. That seems to be it to me. It's like we're dealing with something that has a far more a kind of a
Ability.
far wider grip on the malleability of reality and the capability to do it. But the same thing, the manifestation stuff, it's that's really interesting. That's really kind of a little bit like what you're saying with the hairy hands. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. Like that seems to be like kind of, even though it might be this kind of vast, expansive intelligence that has far more capability than we have, it still doesn't fully understand us. It still doesn't get the nuances right.
Yeah.
We still have the capability to go like, that's not right.
You're not doing this right.
No,
Yeah.
it's that kind of like, what's that joke? It was like, hello, fellow kids. The undercover cop rocks up.
Yeah.
Like, it's like,
I
no
would
one
love
buys it.
some drugs from you.
Yeah. I believe the drugs are great here.
Yes.
So it just has that kind of thing to it. And it's an interesting thing because it appears again and again. Like you look through Irish mythology, there's a figure I've been doing a lot of research on. Is it called the Far Dove, like the black man or the man in black, or the dark black man, and it's essentially this kind of devil trickster figure that appears along the road and kind of like stops or interacts with kind of travelers who are unfortunate to meet him, and he'll give some kind of threat, like if I see you again out here, you're going to die, or if you go this way, you'll die. And it's that same thing. It's always that kind of like really unpleasant, random encounter that people have with this kind of fairy world, with the Djinn world, and this is where kind of like you have these constant use of protective measures to protect yourself from this, like throwing the water out and saying Bismillah. It's just constantly just protect yourself all the time. Same way like in Islam, getting undressed, Bismillah. Washing, Bismillah, all the time to constantly protect yourself from exposure to these things. And it was exactly the same in kind of in Ireland, like pre the last kind of 100 years. It was not even that long ago. Like when I grew up, I remember old farmers telling me there was fairies behind my house and all that kind of stuff. Like that was just part of living tradition.
Randomly, what do you think the difference is between Djinn and demons? Or do you think demons are Djinn?
I don't know that. I think the intention is different. I think they are two different things. So within Islam, they're seen as evil spirits are different to Djinn. So I think it's probably got that to be to the point of origin. So within the kind of is Islamic structure or narrative of the creation of the world and Djinn and humanity. It's Djinn were created from smokeless fire, angels were created from light, and human beings were created from sounding clay. Right, and basically, when Allah created human being, He instructed the angels and the Djinn to kneel before Him, and the angels, who have no free will, did so. And Iblis, who was a Djinn of extremely high intellect and a high achiever, that he was elevated to the kind of angelic host, but was not an angel. I got pulled up on that a few times by some Muslim scholars. Said no, I won't.
That's okay.
I'm not kneeling.
Yeah, I would do the same thing. I'd be like, no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, like, I'm not doing it. And as a result, was cast out. And at this point, when he was cast out, he made the threat, as I kind of counted earlier, that I will beset man on the roadside. I'll be waiting for him to deviate him from the path. And this is the start of the kind of tension between kind of human beings and Djinn. But as I said, there's plenty of Djinn who are seen as being good or agnostic.
Because there has to be some of them who looked and were like, it's not people's fault that God did that or whatever. Like, we're just created too. We're just sitting here like.
But you see the myth of and I'll get to kind of demons now. I'm just going in a roundabout way. Is that the fairies have the same kind of origin myth, that they were the angels who lost in the battle in heaven, and they were cast down. Right. Some angels went all the way to hell. Others kind of stayed on earth, and they're fairies. But the evil spirits have a singular purpose. So demons, evil spirits, singular purpose, and that is to destroy. Right? Djinn don't have that. Fairies don't have that. They're equally dangerous, but not for the same reasons.
Interesting.
Right. But there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of crossover, because there's, the whole thing about like changelings used to be, well, that's the tithe of souls that the fairies have to pay to the devil. Which was what was seen as an Irish folklore.
Wow. So they have to gather a certain amount to... Yeah. Which is interesting, because there's all sorts of, human sacrifice littered throughout various traditions as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I wonder what that sort of crossover came from. Mm-hmm. Is that just whatever Djinn or shaitan, like... Mm-hmm. Messing with people and wanting to be an asshole, or
well, I mean, I think it's food, really. It's the energy that's released from that kind of traumatic process. Is food. What do they get from that? And I think that's simply it. Is that, unfortunately,
makes sense with, especially with Jerry Marzinski's work we were talking about earlier, and that sort of torture that you go through, and lots and lots of food. But I always go back to like Monsters Inc., which I know is just a cartoon, but I'm like, the point seems very apt to me, that why can't you eat my joy and my love, like make me very happy instead? This seems like a way more symbiotically appropriate relationship we could be having.
Well, who's to say that kind of like more positive spirits don't? We don't know. Like in
we just don't have exorcisms for them because we like them.
Yeah, exactly. It's a far more pleasant experience.
Right.
Like within the, if I remember correctly, there's, I think it's in the Vedic tradition. There's the kind of the model of the creation of the universe, and it's like the Devis on one side and the Devas on the other, if I remember correctly, and they're kind of they're stirring the great kind of milk of creation, the sea of creation, and it's made of emotion. If I remember correctly, I could be getting that wrong. So,
wow,
don't at me if you're a Hindu scholar.
It is interesting too that all these traditions have that same sort of parallel in the creation story, where there's divisions of types of entities that were made, and then there's some that fell, there's some that rebelled, there's some that screwed up, or what, it just wanted to do something else, or whatever it is. And they're always, against God or against the creative force or whatever it is. And it's just fascinating to think about. And then, when the way you were talking about it earlier, that it's like they're trying to waylay you, not even necessarily from a religious path, but just anything that would be good for your spiritual advancement, period. You could be totally agnostic, but very spiritual, and they'd still be trying to get you onto a different path. So it's very interesting.
Exactly. And if you think about it in a very broad sense, I noticed someone just talking about the addiction field, and that's exactly what I was about to say. Is that if we think about it in the broad sense of addiction and behavior that is destructive, and that can be from, anything, it's, well, why can't you break those behavior patterns? There's obviously material elements to it, to addiction, right?
Right.
But it's like, if you track back addiction all the way back to its source, there's some sort of emotional trauma that's triggering those things.
Right.
That gets compounded and manifests in that kind of way. That's, from kind of observation from my own experience.
Me too. Yeah.
And I think it's really related to that.
Yeah, I agree. And I always, 12-step stuff can be great. All kinds of things can work wonders, but I really have found that the thing that has healed me the most, and therefore kept me from going back to any of my addictions, has been like emotional and spiritual healing, actual healing, and that came in the form for me of all kinds of different therapy, psychotherapy and post-traumatic stress syndrome therapy and other just healing modalities worked way better for me. And so it makes sense to me that this, like, any emotional trauma or pain that you have, it's like, it's not only being eaten by those things, but it's being manipulated by them, to keep it like growing and like expanding and then engulfing your whole life. And it's so effective. It's horrifying. And it's not to take away our will and our choice in the matter, because I think we have a ton of agency and power, but
that's a really important point. It's a really important, but we still have our own agency and our own journey to take, and like, being aware of the complexity of how things are stacked against us does not mean we do not have responsibility. Right. I was just conscious I was having like a vape as we talked about addiction. And
true. And I'm having coffee and sugar. No, we're not free yet, but it is funny. Like, I think about that, and every once in a while I'm like, oh, I do quit coffee sometimes. And then I'm talking about how I don't drink coffee. And then people are kind of like, dude, what's wrong with her? She doesn't even drink coffee. But I'm like, I'm just very aware that I want to have less and less outside like control of me, like I want to do things because I want to do them, not because some part of my brain or psychology or spirit is like in a trap, like whatever that trap might be. So yeah, I'm not like against people using various types of substances as they would like. I just myself am becoming more and more of like a purist. But like I said, I fall back. I'm sitting here drinking coffee and sugar. So someone just said something that I wanted to pull up, but you guys are chatting so fast. Oh, when people are having experiences where they are hearing or seeing things that not everyone does, I think we have this tendency to think, well, that's Djinn, or that's evil spirits, or that's these things, or it's mental illness, and there's no in between. And I wonder what your ideas are about that, or whether or not, like we were talking about, there could be these positive forces that might also have similar types of manifestations in our life.
I mean, I think it's fundamentally what one of the voices is saying, and kind of unpacking it from there, like being creative is similar in a lot of ways.
True.
Like I was talking about this with Tommy Kelly of Adventures in Woo Woo, and it's people receive creative ideas in weird ways, and you often hear about that kind of thing of like what was it? Like William Burroughs didn't remember writing The Naked Lunch.
Oh wow!
Like he wrote it in like 2 weeks in like a heroin fueled
Wow.
heroin fueled days. Didn't remember writing it. There's lots of cases of stuff like that, of like incredible pieces of art being created in that kind of way, and it's similar. You're being told something or given something that's its time has come. It wants to get out into the world. It might be a piece of art, writing, whatever, and kind of and when you do write, when it comes easy, and when it's just like, you're just crying blood onto a keyboard. You're like, oh my God, just give me a word. What's going on? It won't come. And I think it's a similar thing.
Yeah.
You're getting something from somewhere else, and like anything, it's like talent is without practice, it's not worth anything. But what if practice is actually just making that pipe a little bit,
that connection
clean.
A little bit clearer? And that kind of connects right back to that idea of personal empowerment and responsibility, and that you're what are you channeling in any given moment? If you're going to be surrounded by these spiritual forces all the time, and they're all going to be sort of vying for your attention and access to your channels, so to speak, which ones are you going to align with, and how are you going to know which ones you're aligning with? But someone in the chat mentioned, like, we all have our sort of moral compass, and to keep that true. And I think that's a one good step. And I think also, again, back to emotions and emotional wellness being really key. I think you can feel the difference between good and evil on an emotional level, and that it's pretty clear, But I liked what you said about the content of the messaging too.
Yeah,
it's definitely key.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I within the Islamic view of how to Djinn get into people, but there's two broad pieces now. One, there's sorcery, right, where kind of someone has literally commissioned a magician to send something against you, right? And then the other part is just somehow, for some reason, Djinn has interest in you, and it goes
threw water at them. So
something like that, whatever it might be. But it has to somehow have a way of getting in, right? And how it's described is there's some kind of trauma which weakens your field, and it can get in, and that really, if you kind of look at things like Reiki and look at energy healing, they talk about kind of fractures in the energy field, that where those kind of things need to be plugged up and healed and all that kind of stuff. But these are the entry points, and this is the point of kind of trauma, addiction, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. They're the entry points. Right? It's where we have been damaged in whatever capacity that might happen. These are the wounds that kind of we don't physically wear, but they're there, and they are within the Islamic view of things. Those are the entry points.
Yeah. Good point. It makes a lot of sense, and it's a lot of why I no longer use drugs myself. I don't care what other people want to do with them. I'm not like judging anyone, but I personally find that when I use even low-level drugs that other people can get away with just fine, I have all kinds of attacks and whatever, and I just think that it comes kind of with the territory, but I just think it's good to note, because I think some people might want to be more aware of, especially in like a shamanic tradition, you would say anytime that you're sort of vacating yourself, you're leaving a void for something else to kind of enter. It's the same kind of idea.
Yeah. And like, look, within magical traditions, people talk about kind of like, your meditation practice, right? Know your mind, like, get a grip on what's going on in your head, and practice. You do your meditation, build your body of light, but if you look at kind of like the Abrahamic faiths, we talk about kind of like within Islam, your multiple your prayers during the day, and previously within Catholicism, things like the Rosary, so they're all kind of meditative practices. They're repeating these, they're mantras, they're all meditative practices. So it's irrespective of kind of what works for you, right? Irrespective of those, it's the actual practice that's important.
It's a very good point.
And those things that kind of build your body of light, that actually keep your spiritual armor there. Irrespective of what you believe in, those practices are important.
I totally agree. And this is part of why I say too that I wish that everybody could have therapy, because having done it, I'm like, even if you're not traumatized or, you know, you don't have all of this like huge emotional baggage, the process of unpacking your own sort of psyche and mind, and looking at it and analyzing it and understanding like why you're doing everything that you're doing, all of it, is really helpful in that exact, when you move on then to meditative practices, it's a lot easier to see like where your mind's at and to use your mind intentionally, you know, when you have that understanding. So I know a lot of people don't actually need that, but I think anyone could benefit from it, just like I think anyone could benefit from various meditative practices. And I've had a lot of people say, you know, that there are people who should not meditate. And their reasoning is that it can sort of trigger like traumatic states or memories or feelings or whatever to come up. And that also it almost is like if you're unpracticed or I don't know, that it can almost open you up to these types of energies coming in. And I don't know what to say about that, because I think meditation is so good and so many different types of meditation are so good. And there's a million practices and all of them have some sort of benefit for you, you know, and I've never found any problem with it. But have you heard anything that could be bad or negative about it or could allow in any entities or anything like that?
I mean, I have heard that, yeah. You know, I had someone contact me recently saying that they kind of did a guided meditation and kind of everything went sideways for them.
And do you think that happened because of the meditation, or like, do you think the entity was already sort of there and the meditation like shed light on that?
I think it's an unfortunate set of circumstances, to be honest. From what the individual described, it seemed to be something in their home, and that somehow kind of they just managed to kind of accidentally kick it off. But you know, I think one of the things is that meditation's hard. Like it's really hard. I've been doing it 20 years and I'm still terrible at it.
Me too.
You know, you know, it's and I think it's also kind of getting into your head that that's okay. It's like it's the same as the gym. You know, it's like the only bad workout is the one you didn't do.
Yeah.
You know, so even if you do a crap meditation where you're thinking about what you were doing in school when you were 10, you know, or whatever kind of way, whatever rabbit hole you know, that kind of your brain takes you down, that just do it.
Yeah.
Just do it anyway and get yourself
practice.
back to it. Yeah.
Right.
But exactly. But if you do start to feel bad, stop.
Yeah.
You know, stop. I mean, because clearly that is the case for some people. I think it's a rarity, but you know, we're all wired differently.
True.
But this is why kind of like a broader practice is needed, you know, and it's something that I've only kind of really kind of picked up recently, which is like, you know, things like proper cleansing baths, you know, like your proper salt bath, you know, and that's something that I've, you know, of late found the importance of, you know, it's understanding that stuff and how it all comes together. It's important, you know, but this is technology that we're only kind of rediscovering now in the West.
Yeah.
You know?
I like that. You'd mentioned the salt bath, I think before we started, so people might not know, so you might want to tell that story if you want to share it. It's interesting. And then I want to add, you know, the technology of the water and the salt is like crystals and water, both we have seen receive messages and intention and hold them really strongly. And so do you think that that's part of why that is effective?
It could be. I mean, I don't know. You know, I'm not that well versed in that, but it's salt is a universal. You know, it has a universal properties of repelling these kind of things. You know, it's a protective shield, and it absorbs kind of psychic crap, you know, and it pushes it away. You know, and it's I'm always of the mind to hedge one's bets. It's like I think about it in terms of, I think of it in my head, I call it stacking, you know, so like I'll have iron, I'll have kind of like, what are they called? Hawaz eyes, you know, kind of like, you know, and like witch bottles. You just use
I'm the same as you.
Yeah. Holy water. I'll have it all. Like, what, you know, because I don't know which one will work and which one won't. We'll have a few.
And
know?
I'm of the mind that it is something like that. Like we're putting our intention into this salt in the water, and that's part of why it works. And we're putting our intention into all these things, and we're creating like a field, right, of our intention and energy. And we're saying like every time I smudge, I'm adding to that field of like nothing can harm me in here. Every time I look at my evil eyes above my doors, I'm like nothing can come in here, and you're just reinforcing that in so many ways.
Yeah, I think it's important.
Yeah. And I think also that people out there who might be listening to this and being like, oh my God, there's Djinn everywhere and I don't know what to do. Like what we just said is obviously a lot of things you can try, but also if you do have, I think for me at least, spiritual allies that you like, you know, like people are mentioning Jesus and Mary, and somebody else mentioned, I don't know, someone else. But if you have those types of things, then you can ask any of those beings for help too. And it doesn't even matter what you're doing. You can ask them for help in your meditation. You can ask them for help when you're doing your salt bath. Yeah. You know, whatever it is. And that's
banishing rituals. Yeah. That kind of stuff. Yeah. But you know, iron is a big thing as well. Fairies can't stand it. Djinn can't. Horseshoes.
Oh, I have a horseshoe.
Yeah.
Nice. That's why they're lucky.
That's why they're there. Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, horseshoes over the door. That's what it's about. You know, it's repellent. And but the really interesting thing about the iron stuff, and this is some stuff that I kind of dug up recently, was that there's a reference in the Quran to iron. I think it's got a chapter called The Iron, and what it's actually talking about is that iron comes from the sky, comes from space, it's manufactured in stars, and that it's like it's a tool sent from Allah to command evil spirits. It's like it's literally kind of, if you read between the lines in the kind of in the surahs, it's kind of saying this is the tool that is there to kind of keep the bad stuff in check. And then you know a purba, the kind of three-sided bladed knife from kind of Tibetan shamanism, from Bon shamanism. Totally. So the most those ones are kind of, you know, they're knives for kind of exorcism and healing and that kind of thing. There's like a nail, kind of, I think was where the word Kila or purba translates as nail, I think. But the ones that were seen as the most potent were the ones made of sky iron, which come from meteors. So literally what they're saying is like this is star stuff that can command and repel these beings.
Like God literally sent it down from heaven.
Yeah, to us. Pretty much. Yeah, I mean, I'm really simplifying it in a clunky way, but like that's kind of it. Like, you know, I'm doing it from memory.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I'd never made that connection, and I'd never heard it quite put that way. So that's really cool. I like the chat is very excited about this discussion, so I'm trying to find if they have any questions too. But why don't you, because you've done a lot of documentary work and, you know, and study in really cool places. So if you want to tell us about some of that, that would be really fun to hear about.
Well, I suppose if I start with, we're on topic of Djinn, I might as well talk about kind of my trip to Delhi to basically follow the footsteps of a Scottish writer called William Dalrymple, who wrote a book called City of Djinn, which was basically his account of his year in Delhi, I think in the late 80s, as a young correspondent. He's a historian, travel writer, a fantastic author, actually. He's really, really great, really worth a read. And so I went to the sites that he mentioned in the book, and then kind of one that he didn't, which is the one I mentioned earlier, the Khwaja Muhyiddin Kushti. So I had a couple of mishaps. Camera broke before I went, broken tooth in the airport. Also had real problems with scammers when we arrived. Had to move hotel 3 times in 2 days. Just, and it was a whole raft of just real pains, just really irritating stuff. So I went off to do the shoot. I had a young Kashmiri photographer who was working with me on the piece. And first place we went to was a place called Feroz Shah Kulta. And so Delhi's made up of a bunch of different cities, kind of that come together, and they've kind of risen and fallen, and that's kind of what they're talking about with the city of jinns. In the book, the city of jinns are talking about the jinn can't bear to see Delhi without people in it, so it just kind of gets born again and again. And so Firozshah cult is what's left of the citadel of Firozabad, which was the fifth city of Delhi, and that was built by Emperor Firoz Shah Tughlaq. I'm definitely murdering that pronunciation. And it's kind of this like kind of pyramidal structure with what's called an Ashkatan pillar on the top. And the Ashkatan pillars are these pillars that existed all over India at one stage. There's only kind of a few of them left, and they used to have kind of like on the Indian flag, there's 3 lines. Is it? No, the Indian passport, there's 3 lines standing back to back, and on the flag there's a chakram wheel, and they're actually figures that are taken from the top of Ashkatan pillars. But in this place, in Firozshah Kulta, there's believed to be the king of the jinns is in the pillar, called Latwale Baba. So we turned up at this area, and we spoke to the kind of, there's like a caretaker and a security guard you go into, because it's like a public park, but it's like 5 rupees for Indians, and it's like 50 rupees for foreigners. Yes, yeah. And so I had my colleague Shams, the guy's name, kind of ask, we're looking for this area associated with the Djinn, can you tell us where it is? And they're both kind of just, they're doing the kind of the head nod thing where they're just kind of going, I'm not saying yes and I'm not saying no, I'm just kind of acknowledging you,
but I'm not going to respond.
Yeah, but I'm not going to tell you, you know. And they both wouldn't tell me, and Shams is kind of feeding this back to me, going like, she just won't answer me. So we head in and we walk around, we find a kind of this little bungalow, and then in the back, like, what I then found out was the actual building, you know, the actual structure was there right behind this guy that we're talking to. We ask him, and he does exactly the same thing. He's like, you're on your own there, sunshine. I am not telling you a damn thing. Wow. So we find the place, and it's like I said, it's like kind of 3 tiers with the pillar on the top. The pillar is beautiful as well, but there's all these grottos around it, and then under it. And in the grottos, there's dishes of milk and bread, which are offerings to the Djinn. And what we found inside were all these petitions. So there was letters. There were letters just written to the Djinn asking for wishes to be granted. So it's believed to be the most haunted place in Delhi, home to 10,000 mostly friendly Djinn. And so yeah, we spent the day there photographing it, and I met a family who were going around to each grotto in turn and making offerings and repeating certain prayers. And that kind of, you know, we interviewed them, and they were like saying, yeah, we're doing kind of like a 2-week procedure to ask the kind of Djinn to intercede on our behalf and help us with something. And he's like, yeah, it's happening already, it's working. Yeah. You know, so this is what was going on there. But the interesting thing was the milk and bread was out there for everyone. Yeah. And that's exactly what people live out for fairies. Milk.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that was there. And we went to another site called Nizamuddin Auliya Darg, which was kind of the tomb of Aliya Nizamuddin, who's like a really famous Sufi scholar and saint. And this is a really beautiful place. Like, this is an incredible place, right in the middle of Old Delhi. And it's kind of this kind of warren of little streets, and it takes you then into the shrine. And in there is a certain enclosure, and in that enclosure is people who have Djinn problems, and they're waiting to be seen by the shrine caretakers. It tends to be hereditary. It'll go in a family, so it'll be kind of like they're called like a Sajad Nazins, and they will manage the site and kind of treat people who have Djinn problems. So it was like literally in that enclosure, they're the people right there with possession problems. And I had one guy kind of lock eyes at me from that area and was kind of like giving this kind of manic laughter and kind of like eyeballing me, you know. And I was just like, I was really hesitant to take the photograph. And like I photographed a lot of, you know, stuff that a lot of people would find frightening, or intimidating.
Yeah.
And this is probably the only time I felt frightened taking a photograph.
Wow.
Yeah. And like, I've been in leprosy colonies. I've watched people do Agori rituals and drink whiskey out of skulls, brain dissections, all kinds of stuff. That was the only time I ever was like, oh, I don't know if I should do this.
Yeah.
But being a photographer and knowing that, like, I would not be, I just wouldn't, I couldn't deal with it if I didn't have the image, So I took the photograph, but it was, that was the most intimidating one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like the Djinn was like, you're looking for me, are you? Here I am.
Well, the thing about it is that I had a dream before I went, about 2 weeks before I went, before the camera broke. And it was a really quite vivid dream of being what I kind of now realize was probably that shrine, Nizamudin.
Yeah.
And so kind of, I think this most Thursday nights is a really kind of full-on Sufi music celebration, which is really, really joyful and energetic, and it's amazing, really. And it was like being at one of those events, and then kind of turning to my left, and there was like a Sufi, but basically had like a rotting face, and there was like a snake going in one eye, and it was like something out of Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
And very clearly I got, don't come here.
Wow.
And that that was very intimidating, and that really rattled me. And I deliberated a lot. I spoke to some people about it, and kind of reassured me, and I went, but I didn't have a very good time, and this is. It was a disaster, really. But like, it was not my first time to India. I'd been there for like 6 months beforehand. So like, I was well versed in traveling around India. It was my third time to India, so I knew what I was getting into, and I knew the place really well. I knew Delhi really well. So, it just disarmed me, really, and retrospectively looking back, when that guy was staring at me, I felt that it reminded me of the dream.
Yeah.
So it closed the circle on it, and so it was quite. It was a frightening experience. There's no doubt about it. And I spoke to one of the kind of the caretakers of one of the shrines, and he kind of like blessed me and what have you, and sent me on my way. Kind of told me, yeah, don't worry about it. You're grand. Can you hold the chain? I can hold the chain. I'm like 2 hands holding the iron chain, and it was fine, But yeah, but that was probably the most frightening thing. And as I said, like I've had people trying to stab me, and like when photographing, when I was on a shoot, I've all kinds of mad stuff. Like, but that was the one. It was like spiritually dangerous.
Yeah. Which is a totally different feeling than physical danger.
Totally.
So, do you do you feel like there's a reason why? Because I almost feel like it should be the opposite, where they're like, yeah, come give us attention and take our picture and tell people about us and like increase our notoriety, because that gives us more power or something. Like, why would they be?
I don't know. You? Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell. It's like I think it's like the whole thing of like it is kind of like it's almost like kind of like trickster thing again. It's like it's like the teasing. It's like we
can scare you.
Yeah, we want you to talk about us, but we don't really.
Yeah.
We want you to be aware of it, because your kind of maybe fear or nervousness is kind of is beneficial, or is a reaction we want, or whatever. Yeah, it's fun. I don't know. It's like, but it's maybe kind of the awareness that people get.
Yeah.
That they don't want. I don't know. I've no idea really.
I've had the same exact question to myself before and thought, and I think it's exactly that. There's some level where it's like feeding them or getting whatever it is, that reaction that they want for whatever reason, and then there's another level where it's like, well, now there's so much attention that someone's going to start messing back with us, or affecting us in some way, or putting up restrictions or whatever it is, and we don't want that level of attention. So there's some sort of fine line, I think, that might be being tread in that way. But it's interesting, because you almost expect an entity like that to want worship. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like some of the stories, at least, but at the same time, it doesn't really seem like that's what they're after, or else, I don't know.
Well, I mean, when you say worship, I think there's validity in that, because, what we denote as Djinn, as some of the more powerful Djinn, were certainly Babylonian gods.
Yeah.
Like Lilith, Pazuzu, all these things were like are ancient gods of some description, and kind of like, the same thing that happened within Christianity as it subsumed kind of the attention of the populace, is that it permeated in, right? It's like your nature gods became the devil, the horned god, the god of the forest.
Yeah.
It's like, that is the kind of the dominating effect of the Abrahamic religion, and Islam's the same. So, all of the existing gods and spirits were subsumed, they were pushed down, and the kind of Abrahamic gods took the dominant position. And I think that happens in two ways. So, like, because like the fairies are kind of treated a little bit like old gods too. There's always that subtext there, and it's like they talk about, like, in Irish folklore, the Tuatha Dé Danann, and like they were kind of like those kind of super beings, but they kind of lost the battle, and they went under the earth, but they kind of faded away. Like the Tolkien thing of, like, the elves went into the west, right? It's the same kind of thing. And then there's the whole thing of, like, well, if you want to get rid of the fairies, you pray to God, you invoke God. They're afraid of priests. They don't like the sound of the holy bell or holy water and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's always kind of asserting the dominance of the Abrahamic over this older thing, the older gods, the older nature worship, or whatever it is. It's exactly the same thing in Islam. Yeah. So there's always that kind of slightly propaganda piece. You have to kind of, is that exactly what's going on there? But these things are kind of older spirits that some of them were definitely worshipped.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is interesting too to think about that some of them were, thousands and thousands, or who knows how many, years old. But then there's also supposedly young ones, and so where are they coming from? Like,
yeah, who knows? I mean, who knows how it works?
Yeah.
But from the Islamic viewpoint, within Djinn, that they have clans, they have families, they have children, but their lifespans are like 10 times ours, but that's verbatim what is considered how that structure works.
And just to go back to another thing that's similar, I was just thinking of, aliens, or what people think of as aliens, and these sort of phenomena that we see in the sky. And it seems like they can move really fast, change directions, change shapes, change how they look, and I feel like that's very similar in many ways to the way that fairies and Djinn are described too, that they're like shapeshifters. And someone brought up skinwalkers earlier in the chat, which I wanted to go back to too. It also has that same, description of something that can change kind of on a whim into anything. Which is really terrifying to think of, because, sometimes when I'm walking in the forest, I'm like, what if that's not a tree? Like, what if that's something that just is looking like a tree right now? Like, how would I know,
Well, I mean, it's like when we specifically talk about kind of lights in the sky, like there were accounts that up until the War of Independence in Ireland, fairy lights were very common. In kind of super rural areas. But after kind of the War of Independence, and during the War of Independence, there was a thing called kind of flying columns, and they were kind of like guerrilla groups, like of IRA men who would kind of disappear into the mountains, into the bogs, and then come back down and fight the British forces. So, but with them kind of tracking around the kind of the rural or the kind of the highways and byways of the mountains, these things began to fade away, and they also began to fade away with the kind of the advent of the automobile, right? So artificial light. That's an interesting thing as well, isn't it? Kind of like that kind of like modern light comes, and the kind of magical light fades.
Yeah.
But fairies had an association with lights, Djinn have association with lights as well. I read an account, I think only yesterday, where people were trying to invoke Djinn, and a bunch of orbs turned up. And it all went kind of particularly unpleasant. But so that there's always there's always an analog.
Yeah, every single thing I feel like we can look at, like, apply to all those groups. That's why, earlier we're saying, like, don't mess with Djinn is a pretty good rule, but people tell me, like, oh, I wish I've seen, like, some of the lights or aliens that you've seen, and I'm like, I don't know that you do. Like, why do you want to? I don't trust them at all. Like, because I'm like, if they were aliens, if they had flown here from another universe, why are they just up there fucking around? Like, why don't they come down here and say hi to me? This is ridiculous. Totally. And I don't know what their purpose is. So I don't know what my point with that was, other than that I don't necessarily think people should hope for these things to happen to them, because
we don't know what their motivations are.
Right.
Look, we simply don't, and it's it's like our relationship with animals that we farm, right? It's like we may not have any kind of harbor any direct hostility to cattle. It doesn't mean the relationship works out particularly well for the cow,
right?
The cow has no understanding of our intention,
and you might get a good farmer who likes that one cow so much, and that one gets special treatment, but not the rest of them. Yeah,
totally. So it's a strange thing, but that's the way it is. I mean, but again, look at the intentions, and I saw someone mention kind of like succubus and stuff in the chat kind of a while ago, and it's like there's always this weird sexual interaction with human beings.
What's up with that?
Yeah, this just happens all the time, right? Yeah. And that's an old thing as well, and it's like, and this is one of the things that really kind of blew my mind when I kind of discovered the Irish equivalent. So people get married to Djinn. That can actually happen in
I have heard that. Yeah. Why?
Well, it's a kind of it's in a way it's kind of a funny thing. I mean, it's basically kind of a if a kind of a young man can't get married for some reason, or has to kind of wait to get married, he'll kind of marry a Djinn as a surrogate.
Oh, God.
Right? And then kind of will have like kind of sexual encounters in
probably
the dream world.
Really wildly great ones, I'm sure. Like, I'm sure there's a reason why people do it. I shouldn't have said that. Now someone out there's like, ooh, this is my chance. Don't do it, guys.
Yeah, exactly. But there's lots of cases where kind of like Djinn and spirits of some description take an interest in a human being, or they fall in love with a human being and become obsessed with a human being. And this is where you get the whole thing of like intense sexual encounters in dream world, or waking up at night and feeling that sense of pressure, but then it becomes slightly sexual. And the amount of accounts of this is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I was chatting on my Discord this week about it, or maybe it was last week, about like, I was just, here's news article after news article after news article of a woman talking about, oh, she have married a spirit, and that we have a relationship, and like there's lots of this stuff. So it's like there is definitely a kind of a slightly predatorial, if I'm honest, view from spirit entities of having sexual relationships with human beings. And like there's a case of a young Scottish guy who literally moved continents to try and get away from this female spirit that was just constantly harassing him and terrifying him and being sexually predatory with him. And like he moved from Scotland to Newfoundland and was still followed. So
I don't think they have boundaries like
that.
No,
they don't.
Yeah, like, okay, sure, we'll go there. Like,
so it's similar to the kind of the sleep paralysis thing. There's connections to the kind of like the Hat Man and that kind of weird sexual encounters. But direct analog what people experience with alien abductions.
Yeah, there's a lot of sexual mumbo jumbo going on. Totally. I don't know if mumbo jumbo is the right word, but whatever. but this, and like this is stuff that Jacques Vallée picked up in the 70s. True. He was talking about this specifically, and there's just more of it. We have we're able to access the data
in faster and simpler ways because of the internet now. But it's there repeatedly.
That is fascinating, and it just makes me go back to biblical, scripture saying that the fallen angels came down and mated with human women and produced these giants, and it makes me wonder if any of these encounters does actually produce offspring, whether they're because some people say that is what demons are. It's our sort of cast off spiritual sexual energy, right? Which I'm like, that's a pretty interesting idea, right? And if so, maybe that has some connection to this interaction. Or if there are things like demons, or if there was some who was that? Anne Rice? Is that her name? You got somebody in the chat has to know what I'm talking about. She wrote like the vampire interview with the vampire. Anne Rice. Okay. Yeah. There was some other book that she wrote because I was like obsessed with Anne Rice for a while when I was a kid. Some other book she wrote where humans are having sex with some sort of spiritual entity and they're creating these like almost like gnomes or something. There's some other type of entity they're creating. So it's like, I don't know, there's all these sort of crossovers that it could possibly be. It makes me wonder if there's any validity to any of it. Or if they just like that sexual energy because it's so powerful, and so they're just trying to
that could be, like it could be like the energy source, but there's always a story as well about kind of like genetic matter to kind of like, particularly in the whole UFO thing of like the abductees get told that the race is dying, and it needs the genetic matter to kind of keep it sustained. Again, within fairy lore, it's like, well, the reason they go after mother's milk, right, for their changeling child, is because that fairy milk is not nutritious. It's not good enough. So they kind of, again, they need sustenance from human beings. So it seems to be a similar thing.
There's someone who I really like, Neil Kramer, talks about how these entities might be actually sort of human at one point or whatever in their progression, their spiritual progression. They tried to sort of like skip steps of the spiritual progression, and they sort of catapulted themselves into the fifth dimension, let's say. I think what he's saying. But now that they're there, they can't get out, but they're also slowly running out of whatever energy they got there with. And so when they, hit zero, they die like the true death or whatever and go back to literally nothingness, not even reincarnated or anything. And so that's why they're always trying to get energy from us, sexual energy, fear energy, whatever they can get, because they're shoring up their stores of, juice, so to speak. So like, that's an interesting concept as well. I love all these things because I don't know if we'll ever know, but I like making all these connections and trying to get closer and closer to what is actually going on. But I can also imagine them just laughing, right now, even listening to us, like, that's what they think is happening. This is so dumb. I don't know.
Yeah, it's very possible. I mean, because it is all fundamentally conjecture. I think the one thing we have in our favor is that there's just so many accounts, and there's so many kind of correlated accounts that we're able to kind of just draw patterns from. We can interpret those patterns in completely the wrong way, but at least we can identify the patterns.
And speaking of that, we mentioned some things like steel and meditation and invoking certain entities for protection. Or is there anything else you want to throw on people's sort of possibility list of ways they can empower themselves to do to keep themselves safe? At least, let's just keep it at that.
Juniper is a very good plant to do that, which I found out recently. I have
so much juniper around me. That's awesome.
It's a good thing, and I think it's look to native traditions wherever you are, because the native traditions will have the historic groundwork, and they'll have the practice done, and when I say native traditions, I mean kind of like obviously kind of native peoples all over the world, but I also mean kind of like the native traditions in Europe as well. Like in Ireland, when I say look at native traditions, I mean look at my own folklore. What works? you know.
Yeah.
But we've lost an awful lot of that. Like like there used to be fairy doctors who would go around specifically treating people who've been fairy struck or changelings and all that kind of stuff.
Wow.
We don't really know what they used to do. There's a lot of it's been lost. So it's like it's piecing it back together from what you can find.
Right. Yeah, I like that. It's really good advice to go looking in those areas. And what do you think are people's sort of like the worst things they could do, the opposite of protecting themselves from these types of things?
I think being reckless, like just doing silly things, like opening doors with Ouija boards, that kind of stuff. It's like you've seen enough horror films to know this isn't a good thing to do. It's paying. I think paying attention is that paying attention, being respectful. It's. I think that's the fundamental thing, and like if you want to start a relationship with beings or a magical practice or an altar or that kind of stuff, look into it and figure out what you're doing. You know, like and like it's one of those things like this whole thing of like paranormal investigation. It's like that's dangerous.
Yeah.
It's really dangerous.
I'm with you.
Like it's like apply the same principles to your own life.
Yeah, I really it's the same as when I hear people saying like, I want this to happen to me. I'm like, I don't think you should even say that.
Don't really, yeah.
Like, you're inviting it literally, and just like we were talking about, drugs and other things being possible sort of doorways. I think saying an invitation out loud is a pretty big doorway. So
yeah, yeah, and like when you start looking at this stuff, like ultimately it starts looking at you. And that's it. And so that's why really I won't really ever have any practice, because I don't want to develop that relationship.
No.
Like I'm looking at this solely from kind of an observation point of view, from a documenting point of view. That's it. Right. And I'm very cautious about that. Like
yeah.
And it's really because I had that experience in India. And that experience changed the way I see the world. Like, I mean, I was always kind of like interested in Forteana and kind of like, UFOs and all that kind of stuff, meditation. But, I've had people say to me before I went, they go, do you think any of this is real? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm interested in it, but I don't know if it's real. I came back from Delhi doing the Djinn stuff, and you go, do you think this is real? I'm like, there's something there.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but there's something there.
I don't really want to know much more than I know right now, but there's something there.
Yeah, totally. And if I knew if I knew then what I knew now, I probably wouldn't have gone.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be here, if I didn't. But that's that. Yeah. Would I've done it now? Probably not.
Because what the possible payment has been or will continue to be, right?
Yeah.
There's something to like, I think part of what people don't understand, because I think some people can say like, okay, well, even if it happens, like I'll have like an exorcism or a whatever, various traditions have various practices, but and then it'll be fine, and it's like, I just don't know if people understand that once you have some sort of connection, or however you want to describe that, it's almost like it's easier for more to sort of come, or it's just don't open the door.
Yeah, you just be careful.
And if you do it for a reason and know what you're doing. Or at least that much.
Yeah, totally. I think it's be sensible.
Yeah. And the ghost hunting thing, I'm glad you brought that up too, because I think that these shows have made it sort of like laughable. There's a lot of the things that happen on them that you can tell are fake, or that that their producers are doing various things to sort of scare them and get reactions. And at the same time, there's actually real occurrences that happen to people all over the world and have, like we said, for thousands of years as well. And so, you're going to run out looking for those things, then I just, and you might find
totally.
them.
Yeah. It's not fun. you know, there's the excitement of go, oh my god, we must see something different. But it's, you know, as you say, it's people bite off more than they can chew. You know?
Right. Yeah. Good.
Yeah,
So
you know,
I always like to be heavy on the warning side.
it's sensible. It's very sensible. You know, and like when I talk about kind of like me going to shoot those areas associated with the Djinn, you know, I wasn't going there as a paranormal investigator. I was going there kind of documenting kind of like an interesting angle on a famous travel journal. You know,
like a
like
cultural,
yeah. You know, but I was doing a kind of a spin on it. I came back with a totally different story. You know, like I came back with kind of, you know, these are the people who are possessed, and this is a photograph of people who are possessed. You know, and to like it ended up, instead of being in kind of like a lifestyle mag, it ended up being in kind of like a mind body spirit mag. You know,
yeah.
of where it kind of ended up. But you know, as I said, like it's not like this was completely kind of undiscovered country for me. But when I came back a different person.
Yeah.
You know, and like my understanding of the world and reality and the different forms of intelligence, and what we're interacting with completely changed. You know, so it's yeah, that was it really. But there's always a curiosity there to try and understand and know, and I think that's a weird thing, because I know kind of, you know, by the nature of kind of your podcast, it's probably the same for you. You still want to talk about this as well. You don't necessarily want to draw it to you, but you want to kind of go, does anybody else notice this? You know, like you still have that kind of thing, you know. And I think that's I don't know what it is. I don't know what that kind of like dichotomy is, but it's like it seems to be kind of a conflicting thing, right?
Yeah.
But there still is the need to kind of understand and to try and explore in a cautious way. And I think I also think it's kind of important as well, because you are bringing stuff back and putting it together that other people will then take on and kind of build on, you know, and which I think can be a good thing.
And I really think part of the benefit of it too is realizing, you know, beyond doubt, like knowing, really knowing that you are a spiritual being, and that,
yes,
you know, because our reality, like we said earlier, doesn't acknowledge that, and we've sort of cut it out of our lives, and it's to our detriment. And so, you know, these things, I think that's why they draw our curiosity and attention, because part of us is like yearning to get back to that, but there's ways to get back to it that don't involve invoking any sort of entities into your life, or at least not the ones that are going to mess with you and destroy.
Yeah, totally. You know, and like, again, if that's a road that you feel drawn to go down, it's like, well, go and join the people who know what they're doing. You know, like who have a lineage doing this kind of stuff, and kind of, you know, have a mentor, have a group that know what they're doing.
Very good point.
You know, because they'll help you when things go wrong.
And unfortunately, most of our churches and stuff are not full of those people. There's actually very few of them even believe in any of this, which is very interesting. But that's really good advice. Find groups of people who are already know what they're doing. Because I think also, and this is a kind of random chance, but I think it happens sometimes that people will sort of go looking or finding, and they might find maybe even like a baby Djinn or something, you know, like one that's kind of, or one that is kind of like likes humans and isn't out to get us or whatever. And then they think they like maybe know all of these spirits and what they're capable of or what they're like. And it's like you said, they have a whole spectrum of personalities and intentions, and who knows what they are. And so you can't even necessarily go just off previous experience either.
Totally, yeah. And like spirits lie all the time. You know, this is the most common thing that people who do spirit work will tell you. You know, that they're kind of like those gaslighting friends you hear about. You know, it's spirits gaslight all the time. You know, that's it's a well-known fact, and that's why people need to be mentored if they're going to go down that road. You know, they need to be mentored and kind of learn. If they have a calling to do this kind of stuff, they need to learn it. You know, like I'm documentary filmmaker. You know, that's what I do.
Yeah.
I'm a documentary photographer, and like the whole purpose of kind of what I'm doing is looking at kind of, well, what do the different experts say about this from kind of different traditions, and that's really kind of what I'm looking at. I've like you know, I have no intention of going down that road myself.
I love that work that you do and have done, though, and I think it's so valuable to take from all of these various different places and try to compare it and draw it together, because it's very helpful to a lot of people to be able to really understand, you know, more about what's going on. So it's very cool what you've done. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And where do you what's your next project, or where are you kind of headed, or what's in the future for you?
So at the moment, I've been doing kind of like a podcast since lockdown called Spirit Box, and it's just kind of exploring this territory, which has been a lot of fun. I think kind of the more kind of longer term work will be, I think, eventually kind of a book about this specifically, but talking to it from some of my kind of my travel experiences and stuff that I've kind of documented, and putting that together into some coherent shape, hopefully.
Awesome. That'd be very exciting. Where can people find Spirit Box or any of your other work? And
just at darraghmasonfield.com, and that you can see all the photographs of what we spoke about today are all there.
Yes.
Yeah, and on YouTube as well, and all the Spirit Box podcasts are up there, and like things like the lectures on Waz and the Djinn and all that kind of stuff.
Perfect. And cool. I've linked to that in the show notes here, so if anybody's looking for it, they can grab it and head over there and show some love and see some really cool things. So definitely go do that. And I always like to ask people, as we're winding down, what your sort of final thoughts are on the matter, or your final words of wisdom that you want to offer people, or anything else that you want to share before we go.
I think the main thing to take on board is that this is a phenomenon that is absolutely cross-cultural and global. There isn't any cultures who don't have some kind of reference to this type of experience and phenomenon. What does that tell us? Yeah, like cultures who have never had any connection talking about the same thing.
Absolutely. It is stunning, and it really is thought-provoking, you know, as to what the nature of this place is and what our role is in it. And it's awesome. And I know everybody in the chat has really loved everything that you've shared, and I'm sure you're going to get a lot of hits going to your site. So you guys go check it out for sure. And yeah, if you ever have anything else you want to chat about on Rogue Ways, then, you know, come on back.
Awesome. I'll come and tell you. I had an elderly Irish lady call me about seeing the Banshee when she was a girl today, actually. You know,
I was going to say, it sounds like people reach out to you when they've had their own experiences. Do you want people to be doing that? Is it just happening because of what you talk about?
It happens because I want to talk about. You know, okay. I have had to change on my website. Like, I've got my website. It's like, if you want signed prints, contact here. And then underneath that, I'm like, I don't offer magical services.
Yeah, if you need magical services, go over there.
I don't do exorcisms. I don't do ruqya. You know, but yeah, no, people do. They do reach out to me and kind of tell me things that have happened to them. This is another interesting thing. We talk about kind of. Sorry, I know we're supposed to be winding up.
No, you're good. Yeah, I want to know.
You know, this is one of these things that, like, people kind of will kind of go, well, that's just silly, it's stupid, it's this, it's that, right? You know, and kind of just make a mockery of it. But fundamentally, is those people will not do a ritual with you at midnight on a crossroads. They won't do any of that kind of stuff. You know, no. It's like, you know, that's one thing to bear in mind. People don't put their money where the mouth is when it comes to this stuff. The second thing is that a lot of people, you know, who are like immediately shut things down, they have seen things. They have experienced things. And
they don't want to do it ever again.
They don't want to talk about it at all. You know? And one of the things that's really a value of the territory that we explore is that actually we give people a space where they can talk about something that they were never comfortable talking about, or couldn't understand, or were just terrified of, and all of a sudden they've got somewhere where they're going to go, okay, I'm kind of getting some context for what happened to me, for what I experienced, and I want to talk about it, and that's come about. So like like I said, someone talking to me about seeing the Banshee, 55 years ago, and it's really interesting because some of the accounts that I'm getting, like, it's like kind of a ultra terrestrial bingo card. It's like it's like stuff that comes up again and again. I've had the themes come up in the stories and accounts that people have told me about. So it's really interesting to get that, and I think it's really quite cool for some people to be able to kind of go, this happened to me, I've never told to anybody, and to get a chance to talk about it, I think is a good thing.
Hey, that's an amazing service in itself, and I think that is a really good side effect, at least, if not, of what we're doing and what you're doing, and that's cool. And that could even be another book where you're just like, here's some stories and here's a picture of the person or whatever. To go with it,
totally.
Those things are always really interesting too. So that's cool. So maybe next time you come back, you can share some of the stories with us.
Yeah, well, I'll be recording them. I can play them for you.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah,
that'll be great.
Understand a thick Irish accent.
Yeah, true. I know when I was in Ireland and Scotland both, I was like, I know I should be able to understand you, but I cannot. And they just laugh at me.
I went to America when I was a student, and I was like, I am saying the same words as you speak. Why don't you understand me?
People are like, this guy's crazy. What's he talking about?
What is he saying?
It is so weird. You're like, it's the same exact language, but it's not. I don't know. It's crazy. It doesn't help that I ruined my hearing and booming bass driving around for hours with the bass right by my head in people's cars in high school. And I probably can't hear very well. They say accents are harder to hear when you have damaged hearing. So I think that's my excuse, at least. Awesome. Well, it is fantastic to have you on the show tonight, Darragh, and fellow travelers of the path. It is a beautiful thing. This is your analog, electric, concentric dose of wisdom, according to Darragh Mason Field. Darragh, it's very great to have you, and thank you. And like I said, come back anytime.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Horrors only seem so dark before we look at them closely. Most of what lives and lurks as evil out there is only so powerful in our hearts and minds exactly because it lives in darkness. When we search for truth, we can strip away the illusions and shadows and come away with what is left behind and what is what's real. And it is often much less terrifying than we ever believed, and we are often much more powerful than we ever understood. So until you step into your power, seek out illumination of all the blackest caves and canyons and see the truth in simple clarity. Travel well, aim for balance, and always look inside at first. Mwah.